everybody. Welcome. Welcome. My name is Bill Valerio. I'm the director of this museum. And the first thing I would express is that Woodmere is a very happy and honored museum to be toasting Barbara Bullock, Fearless Vision. And I mean, you know, it's one of those exhibitions that gets better and better every day, literally. And, you know, that is the wonderful thing about working in a museum or being the member of a museum. And, you know, you can come back frequently and see more and more. And, you know, that is really how it has felt. Now, Barbara is here in the audience. And so we need Barbara to stand up so everybody can do a big round of applause and love and all of that. Barbara, you know, really is one of the superstars that it, you know, has been my privilege to work together with to make this beautiful show happen, together with everyone else on the staff of the museum here at Woodmere. We are here today for a lecture program that's going to engage with Barbara and her work and her career in terms of a broad overview of women artists and the history of art history and feminist readings of art history that is happening in conjunction with an exhibition that's being organized right now at Moore College of Art and Design. And this is an exhibition called Refocus. And the re in front of the focus is there because it is a sort of updated exploration of an exhibition that happened in 1974 called Focus, that looked at women artists and women's work as artists at that time, making a point, kind of parting the Red Sea a little bit and opening up doors that weren't open at that time. Lots of things have changed since 1974, including all kinds of categories of like, how would you even be able to decide, what's the definition of a woman who is an artist? I mean, right? I mean, there's so much that has changed in our understandings of things since 1974. And so the show today is going to be very interesting. It opens, I believe, next week, and it's also a city-wide festival. So there will be lectures like this exploring these subjects at institutions across the city. At this museum at Woodmere, at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. There's a show of the work of my good friend Ruth Fine, who's also sitting here. And I encourage everybody to make sure they get to PAFA to see the exhibition of Ruth's work. So it's a, spring season of 2024 in the museums of Philadelphia. Is a festival exploring the work of women artists, looking back, but then also looking forward. So the person that we are here with today, who's my very dear friend as well, Patricia Likos Ricci. And if you're a regular at Woodmere, you know that Patricia is one of the best speakers any of us know. Patricia is a distinguished professor of the history of art at Elizabethtown College, and she's the acknowledged world expert on Violet Oakley and the Red Rose Girls. There's nobody else, that's it. Patricia has made it her life's work to piece together the story of Violet Oakley and then to talk about the significance of this extraordinary legacy in the arts across the broader spectrum of American culture and world culture more broadly. And we've done so many projects together with Patricia. We've got a lot of things cooking up our sleeves together too. And so I know we are in great hands today and we'll really enjoy this lecture. So please, one more time. I'm getting reminded to everybody to shut their cell phones off. So let's do that because that can be a nuisance in the middle of a lecture. I'm doing mine. But thank you all so much for being with us today. And let's have a big round of applause to welcome Patricia Likos Ricci.
you so much for coming. This was an interesting opportunity that Bill presented me with to kind of go down memory lane, and especially in Philadelphia, and to try to recall how it all happened, and this moment when feminist art emerged. And you know, I thought, well, I'm really not sure. How did that exactly happen? And of course, looking back, where you have more information to put things together, I realized it wasn't just, you know, a phone call and women together and people talking about what they were interested in. It was actually part of an incredible movement in the whole society that I think we use the term counterculture for. And so what I would like to do is to show you at least my understanding, looking back, at how this feminist art movement developed, what it was about, and what the legacy of it is. And I think it's worth reflecting 50 years where we are today. So, I'm going to start here in the backstory of this movement, which is about 10 years earlier. And since it's Martin Luther King's birthday coming up very soon, it makes perfect sense to stop and pay tribute to him. But the reason I'm doing this as well is because when I was looking into movements, I realized that the civil rights movement under Martin Luther King was the model for all the other movements that followed. And I asked myself, is that true? Let me see. The things kept falling into place that way. Martin Luther King, of course, was extraordinary. He had learned from Gandhi about taking risks and how to galvanize movements together. And of course, this moment was one that really changed the whole society. But it also demonstrated to other people how to make political and social change. So let's look at the news, as it were, as if we were back at that time. What went on? Well, we had the Economic Justice March. We're just looking now at civil rights marches. The Bloody Sunday police attack, you may be familiar with the image up here of, do I have this right? John Lewis, that's a famous photograph. The march from Selma. Of course, Martin Luther King was assassinated, and then we had, well, before that, Kennedy and RFK. It was a very violent time. But what was interesting is that people did not shrink from following through. They didn't give up. They kept the faith. And we'll see what kind of results they got. Malcolm X was assassinated, and then the Black Power movement developed. Notice the afros, which were a sign that as Black Americans became more alienated from their culture, they would look back to their roots. And this is directly connected to the way we see African influence in the art of Barbara Bullock, but also other artists as well, who learned from what their ethnicity was about as well, and began to integrate that into the society. But immediately we find that women had a response. These are two Black women whose names you may know, be familiar with. Elizabeth Catlett, this is 1969. These are examples of women at the time being inspired, you might say being compelled. I have to do something about this. I have to make something. And it reminded me of where art really comes from. It comes from an urgency, a need, an immediacy to do something with the feeling that you have. And in this case, you can see that both of these were about Malcolm X. Malcolm X speaks for us. Elizabeth Catlett was known, well, or would become known for her beautiful graphics that look like woodcuts on the history of Black Americans and other subjects. So this is a different style work for her. And if you know Faith Ringgold's work, this is not what she'll be doing later on. We'll look at some of her other work, but here's the power to the people. and the moment when the Black Panthers are also emerging. The situation is getting pretty tense. Of course, Barbara Chase Booth made more examples of tributes to Malcolm X than anyone I found. She made this, I'm checking, I had to check, 20 of these very tall, they're about 6 feet tall, beautiful sculptures of cast metal and fiber that were based on ancient Near Eastern steles, these monuments that would be put up in cities in honor of him. And she did these every so often. The one you see here, number 3, I believe that's at the Philadelphia Museum. I don't, so as not to clog up the slides, I, don't have all this information in each one. But these are a couple of examples. Again, 1969, that's very quick to respond. And that's what's important. This isn't looking back and reflecting on a historical figure. These are people who felt attached to someone who was taken from them and had to do something about it. Now, what is also, I think, remarkable is that there was pretty immediate response on the part of the government. If you remember only the terrible things that happened, the crisis, the pain, the suffering, it's interesting to see how quickly the government responded with legislation. Because in those days, the Congress worked. They did things. And all of this legislation was bipartisan. So they actually did things when they went to work. This is before they had these long lunch breaks that go on now for years, actually. So, civil rights, voting rights, the Fair Housing Act, the get rid of the redlining and denying mortgages and things. And then the Supreme Court approved busing. That's a lot. And the point is that the marches worked. The protests worked. Yes, there was suffering, there was violence, but it worked. There was a response. And that's why it became the model for the anti-war movement. Now, Martin Luther King had a lot to say about that, because he pointed out that there was a disproportionate amount of young black men who were going to that war, because something else was different. College was affordable. You could go to college. So many working class, lower middle class, white people, young men, they went to college, and so they had a deferment from being drafted. And so many more black men went and died in Vietnam. He called it out as a racist war, and it was racist in two ways, not just the black Americans who were dying, but the fact that we were killing these Asian people who had never done us any harm, and no one was even sure why we were doing that. The draft, if you recall, was eventually ended for a lottery, worst lottery ever, not like the Powerball, right? You do not want to win that lottery when you have to leave college or go off totally unequipped to fight in a war. And so there were massive protests on campuses, and sit-ins, and marches, and student strikes. And I think that probably everyone has heard about Kent State. If not, you should. It's something to learn. When you look at a photograph like this, you have hundreds of unarmed students and the National Guard who actually do fire into them, killing 4 of them and wounding 9 of them. And so this was the newspaper. That's what you would have read on at this time. Now, one of the reasons that this happened is that just when people thought there was enough pressure on the government to stop the war, President Nixon announced that they would expand the war into Cambodia. And that's what specifically caused the Kent State students to come out on the campus. Now, there was responses, of course, all over the country to what was happening in Vietnam, and the women that you see here would be two women who would also become involved in the feminist art movement. So when we say a feminist art movement, another way to think about it is women who were radicalized during these political movements in the 60s. The fact that they were women is what made it feminist. When we get to them more specifically, we'll see that they were not a homogeneous group ideologically in any way. But here you see Judith Bernstein's work, Vietnam Garden, and she was absolutely just ferocious in her hatred for what the government was doing. She made a tremendous amount of work which emphasized the violence and put it in terms today that we would call toxic masculinity. Then we have Nancy Spiro, who it's a little hard to see up here. You can see it says peace, and this is a mother and child who felt a kind of incredible pathos for the suffering of the people who were being killed on the ground there with these choppers back and forth, and of course the Agent Orange and everything else being dropped on these poor people. So those are just two examples. But Mae Stevens was another artist who records the generational conflict that it caused. This was a real conflict between the World War II veterans and their children. You know, the World War II veterans had saved the world from the Nazis, and they were all for the United States standing up for whatever we were standing up for in Vietnam. I'm still not sure what that was. But she felt it in her own family, and she wrote about her father just epitomizes the bigotry and racism and emphasis on law and order, kind of a head-bashing approach, absolutely mindless, that her father had, kind of an Archie Bunker without the sense of humor, maybe. And she called this series she did Big Daddy, and it was literally about her father. These are the Big Daddy paper dolls here, a little Klan reference, police brutality, and then once the war was winding down, her Pax Americana here of her father and his bulldog. And you'll notice he also has a kind of phallic style about him too. It was also a time when Freudian theory was still being used to interpret art, and a lot of the women would pick up on that. So what happened? Well, Watergate, we had a president interfering in an election. It's shocking. It's very shocking to hear about that happened. And then, of course, the Vietnam War actually ended, and Nixon resigned. So once again, we see very rapidly there is this pressure, and it seems like people are against a kind of immovable object, and then it tips. So it keeps working. Now, that Agent Orange I was talking about, and the carpet bombing of Vietnam, that beautiful country that was so lush, we destroyed its environment. And this was another kind of shocking and unbearable thing. But we were destroying our own environment as well. This was people were kind of drunk on fossil fuels. It was spilling everywhere. There was no regulations about it. There were all kinds of environmental catastrophes. The two in this case that made a difference was the Santa Barbara oil spill, Santa Barbara being a very pricey and beautiful area where you don't want all your beaches and everything ruined, not to mention all of the creatures that live there. And then the Cuyahoga River caught on fire. Now, when water burns, this is a bad sign. I think we know that. Water is not, because how do you put out water when it burns? It's confusing. It's confusing. The solution was, of course, that we had another term from the era, consciousness raising, making people aware how to do this. Well, not a march so much as a celebration in the spring. Earth Day, remind people about the Earth itself, because with all of the space program, we got to see the beautiful blue marble for the first time. We got a sense of this place that is unique so far in the universe. I mentioned the whole Earth catalog too, because that used the symbol of the Earth as its logo. And the whole Earth catalog was about tools. It was filled with things that you could buy to make things, go off the grid, move away from different power sources, take control over your own environment, grow things, organic food, all of these things. It was an environmental self-help book, which was pretty extraordinary, that was out there. So there was this moment when people began to see that they would have to march for this as well. There were some very early interventions in the environment done by women. Here you have Patricia Johansson, who restored a lagoon in Texas. And that was, it's a little bit later, 1981. It takes a while to make these projects, but people also began to realize that nature could heal. You could clean up an area, you could plant things in it, you could restore it, and you could begin to make these interventions that would make a difference. And then Jody Pinto, local artist here, turned to making a bridge, this finger span bridge, she called it, through Fairmount Park. It's really a bridge to just stand on and move through our beautiful park here and be conscious of the value that that has for the fresh air, for all of the other creatures that are going to live there, for its restorative qualities, before it, not to let it get filled up with bottles and rubber tires and mattresses or God knows what else people dump into the wilderness as though it isn't somebody else's home and also all of our backyards. And once again, this was making me very cheerful when I discovered that every movement did get a response from the government. It did get a response. And Nixon, who it's hard to say a lot of nice things about Richard Nixon, but Richard Nixon signed all the environmental legislation while he was in office. He was the one who signed it. He needed, people to like him for something. But, and maybe to his credit, it mattered. But the Environmental Protection Agency was created. Clean air, clean water, it's almost outrageous to think you'd have to have legislation to tell people that they need to have drinkable water so that you don't end up like the 19th century when people were dying of cholera and things like that. But at any rate, so there we see once again social change happened. There was a response to it through the efforts, the mass efforts of people. Well, there was another movement. The big daddies were out feeling, their power, and there was a sense that there were deviants among us. People who didn't want to fight in the wars, people who didn't want to follow the rules, people who were criticizing the government, and then those other people who might have been having a good time at places like Greenwich Village in their little bars, and unprovoked, they attacked people at Stonewall in 1969. They've just celebrated that anniversary too. And that was a shocking event that took place. People may have thought, again, well, that's not my people, that's a shame, I don't know what happened there. But Stonewall turned out to be a kind of shot heard around the world that started really the LGBT movement in the United States. So, Immediately following that, there was a march, which people think is really the first Pride parade that took place, and vigils that began happening every night. And of course, the vigil says this is sacred ground. What happened here is a fundamental violation. But it brought out gay and lesbian people to realize they had to also stand up. So what do? They march. They march, and you have in all these movements both men and women who are doing this. There was immediate response in the art community to Stonewall. Some people, like Michaela Griffo, made a very explicit image of herself and another woman making love in a room. Louise Fishman made a whole group of very angry pictures that were angry Jill, angry Louise, angry everyone about this situation as well. What was the result of the atrocity of Stonewall? The Gay Liberation Front movement starts in '69. The first Pride Parade and a march on Washington. You want to get something done, you have to march on Washington. That was what Martin Luther King taught people. In 1980, the hallowed ground was finally established at Christopher Street Park and the surrounding area, and then under Obama, it became a national monument, historic site. And you see here the work of George Siegel, who made two couples of both men and women with his usual style in the park. And again, the dates, they're somewhat surprising. Not that any of these issues are fully resolved, but we had a government that responded to the people when they realized that the citizens cared that much. Now we finally get to the women. Now, the women have been involved all along, and I was mindful of Walt Whitman's statement, to paraphrase, I contain multitudes. Women were involved in all of these movements because women were of different races, and women were gay or straight, and women cared about the environment. To be a woman involved in a movement meant that you could have these multiple concerns in your life. You didn't have to choose. So the feminist movement, when it starts, is not simply about women, because women always belong to all these other groups as well. But it was Betty Friedan in 1963 who analyzed what had happened in her upbringing, that things had changed after World War II when they pushed women back into the house after women had pretty much done all the jobs that men did because the men had gone off to the war. And then they were pushed out of their jobs and sold a kind of a modernization of what used to be called true womanhood. The true womanhood movement, and that women should be raising many more children to certainly repopulate the country after the war and be homemakers and not bother themselves with, engineering or art or whatever else they wanted to do. And that book, of course, was The Feminine Mystique. But then she also realized there would have to be political action. So she started the National Organization for Women, and that became Women's Lib. And that's when people decided, oh, look at the women, they're all so cranky and bitchy, They're in one of those cycles, those biological cycles. It's either the early one or the late one's even worse, that one. But the fact was that the women's movement focused a lot on issues of women's health care and reproductive rights. It's shocking to realize that it took legislation for married women to get access to contraception, married women, but unmarried women had no access to contraception. And nobody had access to abortion. So this was an important issue, but also there was the issue about violence against women. And violence against women sometimes, produces babies. So these issues were connected, that you could be sexually assaulted and you could not control things, or regardless of your family situation, you had no control over the amount of children you might have. These are familiar arguments, perhaps, for us today. Again, legislation. The government responds. Title IX, which was also non-discrimination, but it made women sports. Women have the right to participate in athletics. Contraception was made legal for unmarried women, the pill, which some people think was the end of the world. And there was this case, Roe versus Wade, where abortion was made legal. It seems like only yesterday, doesn't it? Anyway, response. Well, Barbara Kruger developed her signature style at this moment. This is a poster that she made for a pro-choice march. Have to have the march, which was in '89, because this is when people started agitating against abortion. This was the pro-life response, and when the great tug-of-war started, that is still going on. And your body is a battleground, I think she really, and she put it in the format of a kind of a Life magazine poster that everybody could respond to and continue to work in that style. Well, meanwhile, Professor Linda Nochlin is teaching at Vassar College with all women students, because the women's colleges were not co-ed yet. And she's teaching with textbooks, very well-respected ones, that don't have any women artists in them. So here she is trying to get her students interested in art and telling them about it, but there is no one there as role models. And she starts to think, why? Why has this happened? Looking around New York City, she notices there aren't big retrospectives or historical shows about women artists. Yes, there are galleries where women are showing their work. Often they organize them themselves. But she asked the question, why have there been no great women artists? Meaning, why aren't they great enough to get into the textbooks? And the question can be rephrased, which is, where are the great women artists? And the answer is, they are in storage in the basements of museums. They are in cardboard boxes. They are in private homes. They are there, they do exist, but raw material is not history. Someone has to sort it and pull it together and put it in an accessible form. And this was originally in Art News, where it got tremendous amount of attention. In fact, Art News did a whole issue on women and brought in many of the women who would kind of form this movement and discuss these issues. You see her there also with her daughter. The fact that her daughter's name is Daisy. The fact that she had a daughter made her probably even more concerned. How can I teach women about the history of art if they don't belong to it, if they're not part of it? So she did discover some things that were pretty basic, like that there was quite a bit of great women artists' work, but often it was attributed to men. And this painting is in Woodmere's collection, right? It's hanging, Bill? Yeah. Sarah Miriam Peale of the great Peale family that founded the Academy and the Academy of Natural Sciences. And it's an exquisite technique that she has. Peale taught all of his children how to paint. And because it's so good, it was easy for people to say, oh, well, maybe that's by her, one of the brothers. Maybe that's by the fathers. Because the technique was of a quality that, and if it wasn't signed or there wasn't any record anyone had, it would be easy to say, probably one of the men did that. Although Peale, Charles Wilson Peale, trained his daughters just like he trained his sons. This other woman here, Adelaide Guillard, was clever about her own career. She not only gets herself all dressed up for the portrait, her self-portrait, she presents herself as a painter with her students, her female students. And so the painting is a document about her career, and it's signed and it's dated. Now, we're on the eve of the French Revolution here, so she must have been very optimistic about women's rights. And she only had to wait till the 1940s to vote, because France was even worse about giving women rights. But still, they did produce a lot of good painters. There were women around the Baroque period too, and some of them were getting a little cranky. I think you can see the subject matter here kind of indicates maybe a degree of frustration and hostility. And this was the beginning of not just Linda Nochlin, but Mary Garrard, Norma Browdy, beginning to talk about the gendering of images. And the issue arises, do women see differently? Or do they just have different experiences? And the underlying theme in both of these is rape. Now, Judith in Holofernes is not about rape. It's about the heroine Judith, who is going to free her people from this tyrant that the guys can't get around to killing for some reason. So she's going to seduce him and then kill him. But the unusual bloodiness of this and the two women sawing his head off, it has been attributed to the fact that she was raped by her teacher, which she trained by her father, and her father hired a colleague to teach her, and he assaulted her. And the father took him, to trial, and so this was a big public disgrace that she had to endure. And Judith is a very common subject in religious art, but it's thought that this particularly gory one with the two women climbing up on him may kind of express that experience that she had. Elizabeth Serrani, who does a very unusual subject from Plutarch, where a woman who has been raped by Alexander the Great's captain sets him up and dumps him into a well, which is really, that's what she's doing there. She's lifting him up. So these are women whose weapon was seduction in order to get kind of payback. And they're both very unusual pictures for that reason. But they are not so different from what we saw with Judith Bernstein. What she was doing is that, women can show their hostility and their anger and their political feelings in ways that might create different subject matter than men. Well, one of the exhibitions that was up at this time during this focus on the arts that Bill was just referring to, that should open in about a week, was held at the Pennsylvania Academy and its women. And this is very dear to me. It's because when I looked at that catalog, that's where I learned about Violet Oakley. I hadn't heard about Violet Oakley. I didn't live by Harrisburg. I didn't know who she was. And there was a little catalog entry about Violet Oakley that led me eventually to Edith Emerson, who was the director of Woodmere at the time. But this is a wonderful little catalog of 52 artists, the women at the Academy, who were the pioneers in again, agitating to get life classes and to get a full education. Linda Nochlin realized, well, there weren't a lot of successful women artists because they couldn't get an education. They couldn't get in the schools. And they weren't allowed to draw the nude, which was something that upset Thomas Eakins no end. And the women, very often women did not want to look at male nudes. They felt that they would be sullied by that. That would destroy their reputations. And it had become a kind of impossible problem for a while. At any rate, one of the women in that catalog also is connected to Woodmere now. This is Ida Wall, who was an illustrator. She was one of the first women to take a life class, meaning drawing from the live model at the Academy. She became a successful illustrator with her life partner, Amy Ballard, who she lived with, and the two of them wrote and illustrated a lot of books for children. And you see her lovely self-portrait there. And Christine Huber made the point that she is not mentioned in writings on women artists, in spite of, she lists all the accomplishments she had, and her works are practically unknown today. Woodmere has both of these, is that right? So, and another one too? Yeah. So this is the other thing that happens. Just because someone makes things and other people appreciate them, it doesn't mean that somewhere it's written in stone and it's preserved. It can be like writing in sand. You know, you experienced it and then it was gone. How do you retrieve that and find out who this person is? So we're fortunate to have these images of her. Well, now that women were very engaged with Linda Nochlund's thesis about women artists, they began to weigh in about how they felt, and a lot of women did not want to be known as women artists. One of them was Cecilia Beaux, who was very well respected and quite famous, and she said there's no sex in art, and she thought that these women's shows were a mistake, that what they did was marginalize women. And I show here a beautiful portrait, man with a cat here, of Henry Drinker, because for women who wanted to be working in a certain genre and wanted to be respected by the men, they did not want to appear different. So if you thought that that might be by Sargent, that's quite the compliment. And they did not want to be in that subcategory. This was true of Violet Oakley as well. Violet Oakley was in an all male-dominated field, and she did not want to be a woman artist within that. She wanted to identify herself, which would have made the men the default, and she would have been like, oh yes, you know, she paints big things sometimes. And you can see she's working on the same scale as the men, but she wanted also to be thought of as a muralist. Now, she certainly supported women's rights and was a role model, but she did not want to be marginalized in any way. Well, this is the show we've been talking about that will be coming up kind of, I believe they're going to try and bring the artists back, examples of their work, and this was a moment where it was going to show women artists, what all the women artists were doing. And again, women did not have one homogeneous view other than they wanted to have their work shown and appreciated. This was at the Civic Center. But the gendering issues came up quite a bit, and Sylvia Slay, for example, was addressing the issue of what was called the male gaze. There was this idea that, well, women don't actually have much of a presence as artists in the art museums, but their bodies are all over the place, these kind of airbrushed, hairless, dolphin-like beautiful women. That were designed as a kind of soft pornography for male viewers. Sylvia Slay cleverly kind of reversed one of the famous images by Ingres there and put all men in it. And the man in the front is Lawrence Alloway, her husband, and these are all friends as well. And this was a part of this feminist consciousness. If you do role reversal, like what happens? Does it make you more aware of what's going on? Martha Mary Erlbacher did a beautiful male body that would be like a Venus. And I think that it's very close to Burne-Jones' image. I don't know that that's what she looked at, but that's what jumped out to me. And it doesn't have any negative or satirical or critical content, just a beautiful male body that would be like a woman who was chosen to be admired in this Apollo. Eleanor Anton really hated all these definitions that women were developing. Sex, age, talent, she didn't want any of that. She didn't want any part of that. She's part of the group, but within this group, people have different opinions. And she did a lot of really kind of interesting things. This is her on a diet. This is part of 148 pictures of her every day as she tries to diet. And it's also a lot like these strange kind of clinical photographs they sometimes took of students or, people's body types when they were doing a lot of physiological stuff. And it covered the whole board. This was shown at that show that we were just talking about, at the original show at the Civic Center, something else that's gone. Well, Alice Neal did more than a lot of people to challenge what a naked female body can look like. And nothing is more taboo than the pregnant female body. She had no problem doing that or showing herself as well here. Originally from Philadelphia, but of course made her career in New York and was really a powerful kind of force in this movement. Mary Beth Edelson loved the idea of a essential feminist consciousness. She identified it with goddesses and made photographs of herself that she wrote on, of woman rising from the sea, from the cosmos. She had this sense of merging with the universe, and she liked that very much. She was proud to identify totally as a woman. And her approach to challenging the canon of who were the great women, male artists was to insert everybody that she knew into the Last Supper. And it's a collage, and they're all identified here, some living women artists. This is, all of the information about them is readily available now. It's in the museum. It might be in the modern, I forget, I looked at so many of them. But she put Georgia O'Keeffe in the center as the ultimate, the essential woman. Georgia O'Keeffe did not like that. She did not want to, she thought she was a great artist. She was not a great woman artist. The women of that older generation had been marginalized by concepts of femininity and what a woman was about. They didn't want any part of that. The younger women were rediscovering it. And Judy Chicago jumped on that with her dinner party show, and she went total essentialist and decided if, according to Freud, men have this phallic power that allows them to rule the world, well, what about women? We have organs too. And the dinner party was her way of making these plates of basically, these vulvas that she had. Supposedly the iris, black iris, was the compositional device here. Now, recently there's been a big Georgia O'Keeffe show in England at the Tate, I believe. And as it turned out, the first recognition or interpretation of her flowers as having these genital qualities came from her husband, Stieglitz, and the men that she knew. It didn't come from the women. The men saw them that way. That's where it began, because this was, in the 20s, you had surrealism, and that's when Freudian interpretation was very powerful. And according to Freud, if you remember what Freud said, and there's no reason you should, no one should remember, I think, much about Freud, but Freud's idea about why the women get so antsy and difficult is that little girls at one point look down at their bodies and say, "Where's my penis?" And they feel that they have been castrated. They notice maybe their brother has their penis. Somehow they didn't get a penis, and this gives them penis envy. And then the woman grows up and says to herself, if I can't have a penis, I'm going to have a career. And that's the explanation for the women's movement, according to Freud. He would have said it a little differently, but that's close. Well, Judith Bernstein was not going to have it. She made a series of these giant pictures, which were called out of wood screws, and they hairy screws, and she meant them on every level. She had lots of layers of puns, that we were being screwed, that these screws were also, not just that they were phallic, they were like weapons. She had them standing in her studio, these giant drawings, that they were like, you know, missiles. This was part of her whole hatred for the militaristic culture that existed. And one of these screws was going to be in the show, but it was censored. This is Frank Rizzo's Philadelphia, and his appointee of the Civic Center said no, that it had no socially redeeming value, which was the way they would generally define pornography. Now, the show, this big focus show, 5 women curators, including Ann Dorn and Cora, who was curator of 20th century art at the time, had selected all these artists. This was not a, you know, this was an invitational show. And they were really furious. Martha Tucker, in particular, I believe, had chosen Bernstein. And then they had a petition, they argued against censorship, and the issue, the city wouldn't relent, and the issue was, do we just stop the show? And by then, the work had been shipped in. There was over 100 pieces, and they basically had to eliminate that work. But it's more well known now because of that than it would have been otherwise. Another thing that developed at the time was that some women were aware that a traditional art form of women, sewing, needlework, knitting, this kind of work was a reason to denigrate women of not being fine artists. And Miriam Shapiro, who loved fabric and color and decoration, made these wonderful paintings, sometimes collage, sometimes just painted from them. And she called her movement, her style, famage, which was quite clever. And what's interesting, I think, in retrospect, is it didn't hurt Henri Matisse's career any to have pattern and decoration and cloth and fabric. Nobody said, oh, Matisse, you know, that's too much like upholstery, or what are you doing? Oh, do something serious, paint a nude or something. To get back to Faith Ringgold and the black women artists who were involved too, they knew cloth in a different way. As they had become more interested in Africa, they understood how some of the, I think we've got some masks here as well that Barbara Bullock has made. As they visited Africa, they were able to see the textiles, the incredible textiles that women made, and masks and things. And Faith Ringgold made a whole family of her aunts and other women with the masks that she made, and also their garments based on these textiles. And then, of course, it was inevitable that someday we would have both a woman, an African-American woman, remember that Picasso maybe really didn't discover African art, that it wasn't really there to be discovered. So she is better known for so many of her story quilts, but this one is an important reflection on the history of art, where here you have a black woman posing for him, but you have Les Demoiselles d'Avignon all the way around. And this is a quilt, one of her story quilts as well. Well, you might be familiar with this work if you've been coming to, oh, I'm looking at it right up there, these dancers. Hard to choose so many incredible examples of how Barbara Bullock took her experience in, she traveled everywhere, but in Africa, and worked that not just as a surface style, and I hope my interpretation is going to be acceptable, but what I see also with the names that she gives her work is something deeper, that art was not about how you decorated the surface and your materials and some stylistic tradition. It was about the spirit and about its power to heal and release energy, as she talks about it. And also, it was holistic and animistic. It was not just about people, it was about animals as well. And these kind of totemic spirits. It had a kind of harmony with nature that had psychological value for people too. And it's all over this room. It's really quite extraordinary to see. And of course, her dancers as well. So it's a very small part of this talk, but it's all around us as well. Very different was Ellen Powell Tiberino from the kind of the Mantua area of Philadelphia, kind of a delicate, sensitive artist who I believe, Barbara Bullock, did you know her? Yeah, I think I read that. And who sadly died too young of cancer, but her work was extremely sensitive. She wasn't interested in some of those same things, but she makes this beautiful nude here of summer fruit, and this sense of kind of fertility and grace in her work. So there's a kind of a sweetness and gentleness that was part of her nature. Anne Minich brings us to the gender issue. In this drawing that she does, her father's daughter, where she's showing, where does this gender identity begin and end? In appearance, in DNA, in sexual orientation. What is it we identify with? What is this? Can this be a single thing? And there is this kind of gender fluidity that you see here in her work, and this ambiguity about who people are and how they are defined. That's kind of where we got after all this identity politics. It's not easy to pin people down because we're more than one thing. Jung Mi-yoon did ask the question, why do we use color for gender? And made these two pictures of the affluent Korean consumer culture where people just buy their kids tons of toys, and you go down the blue aisle and the pink aisle. I heard recently the pink aisle may be eliminated now, and we will not have color-coded ways of identifying children because we don't want the little boys to be emasculated if they have a pink bedroom, and so a very clever way, I think, to really deal with that. And she shows these kids and all their incredible consumption. Diane Burko, it may be known to some of you. She taught at Community College of Philadelphia for many years. She was one of the moving forces behind the original Focus show, and she's working on it now. She began as kind of working as a landscape painter and then got much more involved in the environmental movement, now flies around following climate change and making enormous sized paintings to draw people's attention to how things are changing. And she recently had a very large exhibition at American University called Seeing Climate Change, with this idea that how do we convince people that it's actually happening. Alice Dennis, Hungarian-born, but was part of the show, worked in Philadelphia for a long time. She was one of the people in the original Focus show. And her work at that time was just these diagrams. She was involved in this theoretical aesthetic, she called it. But this percolated in her for a while, and she began to make these very large earthworks like this living pyramid, which is in a castle. She is still alive in her 90s today, and kind of demonstrating how works of art can become part of the environment too. They don't have to be intrusive in putting objects in, they can be organic as well. Her most fantastic idea was the Time Mountain capsule for Finland, and she actually got permission to build this with help, I think, also from the UN. And the concept is really quite amazing. Her idea was for people to have ownership and guardianship, stewardship of the environment. So the idea is that there will be it's happening now, 11,000 trees, but each tree belongs to one person who is responsible for their tree. So it's a forest, but it's a forest in which each tree has a kind of a guardian. And so she actually built this. I think I left a zero out there. It should be 11,000 people, 11,000 trees. So this was the theoretical stage. Then you see it being built here, and now it's growing up in Finland. And of course, trees are a big part of the solution. Colleen Giannatempo, young artist now, made a Me Too Femage flag, and going back to this idea of being female and proud, of pink and flowers and that whole kind of culture as well. But I think that we would be remiss if we didn't remember these two creative geniuses, the Pussy Hat creators. These two young women, Krista Sutton and Jana Zweiman, created the Pussy Hat in response to some remarks of a presidential candidate that nobody thought was going to get very far. They were used in the March on Washington. They started this project, and the pinkness of it, the textiles, it's part of this whole feminist movement in art, that this assertion. It's also about taking insults and turning them into assets. And I end with them because also the Pussy Hat has achieved fine art status. The Victoria and Albert Museum now are the proud owners of a Pussy Hat and consider it to be an important American artwork. And who knows, we have another election coming up, and you might want to get your Pussy Hat out or make a new one. So thank you very much.
I think we have time for questions, and I have a microphone, and Hildy's going to take the microphone, and if you'd like to ask a question, I think we can open up the dialogue.
Yes.
Well, I just wanted, in case people didn't know, that Judy Chicago's dinner party is at the Brooklyn Museum, and if you have not seen it, it is amazing. Places were afraid to show it in 1980 when it first toured, but Brooklyn Museum bought it.
Thank you for that.
Did you have a question? Thank you so much. That was a massive project. You really did a lot of research. I thank you for that.
Thank you for staying awake.
It was very easy to stay awake. And I hope that a lot of this does become history. I hope that we don't have to discuss it the way we do today. It's still such a pressing issue. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
I couldn't help but feel, listening to the progression of your talk, Patricia, the intertwinement of art and politics. And it has struck me, again, living with this beautiful exhibition of Barbara's work, that really the same thing is happening. That, and this is more a comment than a question, but I'd love to hear what your thoughts are about this or other people's thoughts on this. But what I felt as I've come to really live with these works, that I am reliving a history, that I lived, starting with, the AIDS crisis in terms of my life experience, the Healing series and the AIDS crisis, Hurricane Katrina, and, how that kind of turned a part of the world that I thought I knew upside down. Trayvon Martin is over here. Upstairs, George Floyd portrait, which is extraordinary and beautiful. And so what I was struck with is the degree to which, what you've done, Patricia, is show, how kind of politics and art are flowing back and forth into each other. And I feel like it's especially relevant to this exhibition because, I think it's hard to experience the show without feeling that overlap. And I wonder if you have anything to say, or if Barbara, you would like to. And I see Barbara saying nope. But yeah.
Well, the remark at the time of the slogan was "the personal is political," and the response that people have. This was what I was trying to show with the women who responded during this earlier period. It came out of just what you're describing. You experience a trauma or some concern in assassinations and murders of people, and you need to make something about that, not just to commemorate it, but so that you can live with it. It's like waking up from a nightmare and having to tell somebody and show them something about it. But I also think that this may be very important in a democracy, because as citizens we feel that our response, I make a drawing about something I care deeply about that has happened in my society, and it means something. It's like my cultural vote. It's my way of weighing in on what matters. And collectively, especially when you see this fantastic long period of work, this huge body of work, you can see the whole history of someone's participation, not just in their own artistic development, but in a kind of citizenship and making statements about what goes on. And in countries where there is censorship, that cannot happen. That isn't welcome, or you've got to hide it away. Yeah, books. Yeah, we're at a tipping point, the 50 years. I try to make it light so it isn't so terrifying. But we see this rolling back. But we also see the energy is in the opposition. They're mobilized now, because a lot of things have been established. And they're out there, banning things, What legislation we have is dismantling the legislation that we see here. So it's a frightening moment, I think. But we may have to do it again.
Question.
Sorry? Yes. Get to work. Yeah. Yeah, please, she has your microphone. Speak some more if you would like to make a point about that. Yeah. Okay. Mindy.
Well, it's loud. It's very moving to see this artwork that was made at a time when I don't know whether those people thought they were going to win, but they thought they could win, and they were not waiting to find out whether or not they could win to make the work. So I think we need to put ourselves back in that situation that we get to fight the fight, whether or not we're going to win. I hope we win. I hope we win. But we don't need to wait to find out whether or not we're going to win. We really get to put our minds, each one of us gets to put our minds towards which project has your name on it and what do you want to do. And this work really inspires me to think about that for myself, and I want to invite all of us to ask that question, and the answer will be different for everybody. And I love what you're saying about a culture, it's part of citizenship and it's your cultural vote. Because I think our biggest enemy right now is our own discouragement and sense of our own insignificance. And our job is to have the same courage that our ancestors here have had in being willing to try.
Thank you. That was beautifully said.
Yeah, so I was interested in how you draw the connection between the civil rights movement and the women's movement, among other protest movements. But I was wondering about going back even further in time, if you are aware of women's art that responded to the abolitionist movement that turned into the suffragist movement, where there were women involved in the abolitionist movement and then said, we need to do something for ourselves too.
That's a really interesting point. That's that first half of the 19th century. And women were very active. Philadelphia in particular, you had the Quaker women, the Female Anti-Slavery Society. They had trouble just speaking. Their act of speaking in public, they had to sort of jump up and insist on having something to say. They were excluded from meetings. And, you know, I don't know if they made images that were like that. Around the time of the Civil War. Not that it was fought over slavery. We're not sure. We're not sure about that yet. So the jury's still out on that. But if it was, there might be images like that. They would have shown up maybe in what they call broadsides and that. But I'm not familiar with that material. But that's a very interesting idea. Someplace like the Library Company of Philadelphia might have that material to look at, but intriguing for another time, but very worthwhile. Thank you for mentioning that.
Thank you very much for a really enlightening talk. And I wanted to talk a little bit about women in folk art. And they're expressing their own personal women's experience through their art. Is there any?
Well, are you thinking of someone in particular?
I'm thinking of the great quilters. Overwhelmingly are women. And yet it seems that you make a whole category to keep them out of the mainstream of art. And that's another way of really denigrating the work of women artists.
Yes, I think that, you know, Miriam Shapiro touched on that a little bit with the handicraft. But yes, I mean, Rauschenberg has a piece, I forget the name of it, which he has a beautiful quilt and throws paint on it or something, and it's brilliant. You know, and I remember seeing that and thinking, oh, he really messed up that, you know, that quilt. That wasn't like just patterns and colors, and it's not raw material. Somebody put, you know, I think they're like 20 stitches an inch. But I think now, and out by Elizabethtown where I work, the Amish quilters are out there. And all of that work is so fantastic, and the Guy Bend quilters. So I think there's more appreciation for them now in museums. They didn't fit into my trajectory, and you'd be here all night. So that was why. But that's a good point too, because among folk artists, they're closer to the way art is in other cultures, where there is no fine art. There's the things that people make to ornament themselves, to celebrate things, to heal, to respond to their environment, and they don't have our Western classification system. A whole other group that I didn't touch on are Native American, indigenous people, and it was a little too depressing maybe, but you may have heard of the red dress installations, because we have Native American women who are disappearing. And what some of the women in that community are doing now, again, coming up with something, what can we do? They hang just a plain red dress for every woman who is disappearing, to make people stop and look at that and say, what does that mean? So art comes from these deeper levels, much deeper levels. And I think that what was being said before, well, we have to do it for political reasons, but all of the art that we've been seeing that women make, you also do it so you feel better, so you feel that you didn't just suffer this trauma, you made something, you coped with it. But you're right, so we have to do early 19th century and the folk art, yes. So that's. Good idea.